Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's really, really good to be able to talk to you today and share some of my thoughts. They are just my thoughts. Not all of these are formal MHRA policy, for discussion, for thinking about, and perhaps something we can take forward as we go on. MHRA is made up of 3 centres, if you don't know. So we've got CPRD, the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, and we've got NIBSC, the National Institute for Biological Standards and Controls. And within MHRA, the regulatory bit, we have medicines and medical devices, including in vitro diagnostic medical devices. And I'm coming at it from the perspective of the in vitro diagnostic medical devices, the IVDs, because that's the area that I know best. Other people will, because a lot of this AI space is medical devices, not IVDs. So, you talk to different people, you get a different perspective. And I think that's what I would like to impress upon you. This is not exactly how it's all going to be. It's how Steve thinks it's going to be from an IVD perspective. If you don't already know, I'm just going to walk through the basic concepts of medical device regulation, because if you're used to medicines regulation, it's quite different. I'm going to talk about the transition, as Chris mentioned, from the directives through to the regulations, and some of the differences that might mean for software in particular. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the MHRA approach to software regulation under the directives, and we need to think about how to transition that to the regulations. Think about how medical devices and IVDs might be used in healthcare. Gary's already given us quite a lot of ideas there, and I just want to kind of add to them from my perspective. And then I've just picked out 3 challenges, I think, for regulation of AI medical devices and IVDs. So basic concepts in regulation. We start off not with the CE mark, but with the product in development, so the performance study or the clinical investigation. And that's a formal process, which if it's a higher risk study or an interventional study, then that will need an assessment by MHRA before that study can begin. Otherwise, if it's not an interventional study for an IVD, if it's an observational study, then you could start without a letter of no objection from MHRA. This is in the regulations. I'm not talking about the directives here. I'm talking about the regulations. Once you've got all your clinical evidence, once you've got your quality management system and your risk management process, your risk-benefit analysis in place, put all that together in technical documentation. That technical documentation is described in great detail in the regulations, and you'll hand that to your notified body. If it's a very, very low-risk device, a Class 1 device or a Class A IVD, then you don't need a notified body. But for all those higher risk classes, you will need a notified body to have a look at that documentation. They will scrutinise that documentation either on a sampling basis, or for the very high risk, they will look at every dossier. And for some devices like combination products, a medicine and device combination product, a companion diagnostic, which is an IVD, which is essential for the safe and effective use of the corresponding medicinal product, or for a device which has a medicinal component, like a drug-eluting stent, then we have a medicines authority review of that as well. They will give an opinion. Then you can get your CE mark. You get a certificate from the notified body, which allows you to have your CE mark. And then it can go into clinical use. And I think what Gary's talked about is that link between getting something regulated and getting it into clinical practice. That's not really an MHRA role. There's also the health institution exemption. So this is changing at the moment under the directives. The health institution exemption is if you make and use a device within your hospital, you don't have to worry about the regulations at all. Yeah? There's no regulation there. There's no guarantee. You don't have to demonstrate any patient safety at all. Under the new regulations, the health institution exemption changes quite significantly. It means you can continue to be exempt. You don't need to have the CE mark. You don't need to have the notified body, but you do need to demonstrate that it's safe. You do need to have all that clinical evidence. You do need to demonstrate that it meets all of the general safety and performance requirements. You need to have a quality management system in place. You need to have a justification for using it. And you need to make some of your information publicly available and have that documentation in place as well. And it's not just, I've drawn this as a linear process. It's not really a linear process anymore. It's a cyclical process. So actually, information from the device or the IVD in clinical use needs to feed back to the documentation, back to the clinical evidence. Does the device continue to perform as you intend throughout the life cycle of the device, throughout the whole lifetime of the device? And there are structures in place in the regulations which force manufacturers to do periodic periodic summary update reports. For the high-risk devices, they will be publicly available. So in a nutshell, that's the basic concept of devices regulation. Those of you who are involved with medicines and companion diagnostics, this is my kind of take on how companion diagnostics will be regulated. That's pretty much what I've talked about along the bottom there. Again, from an IVD perspective, a companion diagnostic is an IVD. You get your analytical performance and your scientific validity. I'll explain these terms in a moment. You go to the devices authority before you start your clinical performance study, and then you can get your CE mark once you've been to a notified body with a medicines authority opinion. And that will, I've drawn this here as if it matches seamlessly. Phase 1 trial, authority review for your clinical trial, phase 2 and 3 trial, medicines authority review for your marketing authorization. In an ideal world, that will all go ahead in a nice coordinated way, and you'll get your companion diagnostic on the market at the same time as your corresponding medicinal product. So what's changing between the directives and the regulations? I'm assuming you've all got some familiarity with the directives. In terms of the regulations, there's going to be a huge increase in notified body scrutiny of medical devices and IVDs before they're placed on the market. And we're already seeing that as well. We've got a joint assessment programme where the scrutiny of notified bodies by competent authorities and by the Commission is rising, but we'll also have more involvement of notified bodies pre-market before that device gets its CE certificate. We're going to see a lot more notified body scrutiny. MAID is manufacturer, authorised representative, importer and distributor. So there are now regulatory requirements for people who are importing and distributing medical devices. When you think about AI and you think about software, what does that mean for the app stores? Do they then become distributors with requirements under the regulations? Of course they do, but what do those requirements mean for software? What does distribution mean in a software context? UserMed is the European database for medical devices. That's going to be completely revamped. And going to be the big all-singing, all-dancing IT project, which will be delivered on time and within budget across all 27, 28 member states by May next year, I think. That's on track. That will work. That's going to happen. I'm confident. The health institution exemption I've talked about, and that's a big change, I think, if you're developing devices within your trust. Clinical evidence requirements, particularly for IVDs, are going to increase quite a lot, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And the post-market activities we've already talked about, periodic summary update reports, post-market surveillance reports, post-market clinical follow-up, post-market performance follow-up. Your notified body can say to you, actually, you need to do some post-market work on this. You need to do a formal study to demonstrate that you can continue to meet those requirements, that you can develop your device to something that's just nearer to something which we would like to see. Specifically, there are two sets of regulations, one for medical devices, one for IVDs. So most of these ones apply to both medical devices and IVDs. The medical device regulations were published in 2017, and they are going to be fully enforced in 2020, so just next year, in May next year. There are I find this really kind of strange, this non-medical medical devices, things like cosmetic products, which are listed in the medical devices regulations. I don't think there are any software products in that list, but it's things like plano contact lenses and lipo fillers, that kind of stuff. IVDs, 2 more years, 2020. We've talked about companion diagnostics. The 80-20 there is one of the reasons why we've got 2 more years in the IVD regulations. There is an estimate that 80% of IVDs currently have no notified body scrutiny before they get a CE mark. They're self-certified by the manufacturer, and only 20% of IVDs have a notified body involvement before they get a CE mark. That's going to flip right over, and it'll be only the lowest 20%, lowest risk 20% of IVDs which have no notified body scrutiny, and 80% of IVDs will have notified bodies. So that's a massive change, huge change for notified bodies. And the latest estimates I've seen are actually, it's not 80-20, it's more like 90-10 or maybe even 95-5. So quite a lot of change for anything which is an IVD. It's an up classification of just about everything. Specifically around software, there are now specific requirements around compatibility and interoperability. So if your software is being used with other devices within a device or between 2 devices, then there are requirements to make sure that they are compatible and interoperable. There's also starting to get a definition of what is a minor revision to software. I think that's really important because as you take major revisions to software, they may need to go through a specific regulatory process. But minor revisions may not have to. And this is when we're discussing things like UDI, the unique device identifier. You don't need a new unique device identifier for a minor software change. But I think it's important that we get to understand what is a major change and what is a minor change when it comes to software, particularly for AI and particularly for machine learning. Medical device regulations introduce specific classification rule for software. So again, whether it's an IVD or a medical device, everything's going to be up-classified. There's going to be a lot less software around which is self-certified by the manufacturer. Most of it will now have to have some kind of notified body scrutiny before it can get a CE mark and be placed on the market. And for IVDs, some people thought that software couldn't be an IVD, that there's no such thing as IVD software. Well, that's not true. And that was implicit in the directives. It's now explicit in the regulations. Yes, software can be an IVD, and also for some reason in the IVD regulations, but not in the medical device regulations, there's reference to reference databases, and they need to be characterised, and we need to understand which reference databases are being used with the IVD. I know that's not very clear, but those of you who've seen on our website, and the link is just here, those of you who've seen on our website the software, it's an interactive PDF, so you can go through the flow chart, and it'll help you decide from a directives point of view, not from a regulations point of view, but from a directives point of view, whether your software is not a medical device, whether it's a medical device or a medical device accessory, whether it's an IVD or an IVD accessory. And that flow chart, we've got some really good positive comments coming back from it, so I'd really like people to challenge it with some more complex bits of software. Is it an IVD or is it a medical device? And I think that it's not always clear to me whether something's an IVD or a medical device. But have a look at that. I think it's a 36-page interactive PDF. It should be quite intuitive to use. So, thinking about how do you characterise the performance of software? So this is the triumvirate, from my perspective, about how to characterise the performance of an IVD. So you have the analyte, the thing which is being analysed, the biomarker. You have the device, the IVD, the thing which is doing the analysing. And then you have the clinical condition that it's looking for. And you need all of these three things to be able to characterise the performance of an IVD. The link between the analyte and the clinical condition is what we call scientific validity. The link between the analyte and the device, how well the device measures or detects the analyte, is called analytical performance. And the correlation between or how well the device can give you information about the clinical condition is called clinical performance. You need all three of those for an IVD to be placed on the market in the new regulations. I was thinking, well, software generally, whether it's an IVD or a medical device, is just like an IVD. It's giving you information about a patient based on some kind of input. Okay, the input isn't an analyte, the input is data. So could you not have the same kinds of things to measure, to characterise the performance of software? So these are the definitions of scientific validity, of analytical performance and clinical performance that are written into the IVDR, as I've just described. And kind of my speculation, my wonder is, can we apply this to software by just changing analyte and talking about data input? Instead of talking about detecting or measuring an analyte, we talk about analysing how well your software analyses the data input. Just a bit of speculation there. I don't know how that would then apply to, that could easily apply to an algorithm. I don't know how well it could apply to AI, particularly when you're having to constantly update the software, constantly update the performance characteristics, because performance characteristics of AI will change over time. So how can we have this as something which is evergreen, which is constantly updating? If you're developing a piece of software, then you'd need to go to your notified body with a whole load of documentation, particularly around clinical evidence. And there's the kind of, we talked about scientific validity report, analytical performance report, clinical performance report. Additional studies would be, now here stability might not apply to software. Validation, verification would. Sterility, no. Animal, human and microbial substances, no. Measuring function, probably. Combination, well, we often talk about software as standalone software, which wouldn't be used in combination with other devices. But I think that's probably not always true, and you are using software with other devices, in which case you need to have some evidence that that combination of software and other devices works as intended, and everything, the whole system performs as intended. And then it's that critical analysis. It's not just putting together all of those reports, it's that critical analysis, a qualified assessment that the device achieves the benefits and the safety according to the state of the art in medicine. And who can give a qualified assessment that a product meets the state of the art in medicine? I mean, that's got to be clinicians, hasn't it? So the manufacturer will need to be able to find somebody who can assess all of this information and give some kind of report about the clinical evidence about the qualified assessment. The notified body will need some kind of clinical input to say yes, the manufacturer's assessment is okay. And of course, competent authorities will have to understand when we need to go directly into manufacturer's information, or when we're looking at what notified bodies are doing, we'll need that clinical expertise and scientific expertise as well. What is artificial intelligence? I decided not to try and define it because the directives don't define it. So it could be anything from this is the picture from Wikipedia of Thales, the bronze, the Greek figure, which is a bronze robot who is able to defend Europa from attack. I don't know if that's relevant to anybody. But of course, all these other things which people might start talking about as being artificial intelligence. I'm not saying what is and what isn't. I'm just saying there's a lot of work in this sphere. Actually, from a regulatory perspective, it's not that much of a problem whether it's AI or not AI, because all of it's covered. Particularly as we talk about what some of the applications are, if it's diagnosis or interpretation of a clinical condition, either from analysing data or from analysing images. And by diagnosis, I don't just mean delivering a direct definitive diagnosis. It could be an aid to diagnosis, it could be screening or monitoring, it could be prediction or prognosis. So that term diagnosis is a very broad term. So we can see software AI being used for diagnosis and interpretation. We see software being used in therapy. So a chatbot delivering cognitive behavioural therapy could be with the way that, and by the way, this doesn't have to be done within the UK. The product which is providing this service might be in the US or China. Now there is a distance sales provision which says actually if you're providing that service to the UK, to the EU, then that product still needs to meet the requirements of the regulations. So you can stick your product on a server in the US, it still needs to meet all of the requirements. So your chatbot, drug prescribing, particularly for pharmacogenomics, stratified medicine network drug prescribing. If you're using a companion diagnostic, using an IVD to assist with your drug prescription, absolutely. If you're assessing a patient using an AI tool to say, yes, this is the best course of treatment for that patient, either as an augmented intelligence or as an artificial intelligence. Decision support and even daily living. You can see, I don't know if anybody's used augmented reality on Google Maps. You kind of finding out where you are by looking at the buildings around you, and it decides, oh yes, you're now in what street are we in? Earl Street, or Finsbury Square, and it'll recognise from the buildings. Now it's not too far to say, well, put some of the tech from driverless cars and tech from Google goggles, and you can have something which allows people with visual impairments to wander around safely without bumping into objects and find their way around a city. That would be a medical device. It's no different to a pair of spectacles, but exceptionally high tech. Then perhaps less obviously, some things which perhaps are administrative tools are not medical devices. They're administrative tools. But if you're starting to use them for triage, Gary talked about the GP product, which would be a medical device if it's used to triage patients. I've seen a product which is taking referrals for cancer from the GP and using natural language processing, deciding which ones should be pulled out for a more urgent assessment. That's kind of a more risk-free way of doing it, because everybody gets treated in the same way, except if you need something more urgent. But what happens if you put a piece of software that says, no, these guys can wait till later? Different ways of doing the same thing. One's perhaps more risky than the other. And then research. Research is not medical devices, it's not regulated. We don't regulate research unless it's a clinical investigation or performance study. But how about if you're determining the eligibility of a patient within a clinical trial of a medicinal product? If you're deciding who's going to be in your trial and who isn't, and you're using a piece of software, does that software become a medical device? Quite possibly. And what about the evidence generated by AI? What about the use of AI to analyse data, which could be part of your performance study, part of your clinical investigation? These are not regulated tools, but are they appropriate for marketing authorisation of medicinal products, medical devices, and IVDs? Then my last slide is just looking at the challenges. I've just chosen 3. There's loads of them, and you can and I'll talk about these briefly. But you could put a lot more detail into these as well. So I'm not pretending that we've got all of the answers. I'm not pretending we've got all of the questions. But just to start, for the conversation, change management is absolutely critical. You take your AI software at point A. Maybe it's had enough information to get a CE mark. By point B, it's a different device. It's got different performance. Perhaps even got a different intended use now because it's done all that machine learning. So how do you version control that? How do you say that point A to point B is okay, is acceptable? What's the regulatory process for that version control? Does a notified body have to assess it every time? Because that could really slow things down. Or is it such a minor change that actually a notified body doesn't need to look at that, the manufacturer can cope with that themselves because their quality system copes with those changes? And you look at things like ISO 13485, the international standard for quality management for medical devices. Is that sufficient for things like AI? Is it fast enough for that innovation? Clinical evidence, we want to see the clinical evidence throughout the lifetime of the product. We also want to start thinking about what can you use to demonstrate that AI, that algorithm is okay? There's a lot of data out there, and there's a lot of patient-related data out there. As part of the Regulators Pioneer Fund, MHRA will be working to look at synthetic data sets to see if synthetic data sets can be used as part of validation of a medical device. That should be quite an interesting process because it's not so. I believe it's not so difficult to produce a synthetic data set, but it might be difficult to open up all your patient registry information to commercial developers. And then finally, regulatory awareness. I think there's a lot of people who are busy developing software products, developing AI, who have no idea about devices regulation. Don't know, don't want to know. But if you're working in a lab, you're working in a back office somewhere, you're not traditionally part of the medical device community or IVD community, not part of the clinical community, how do you know about the regulations? What about competent authorities? We're aware of the regulations, but are we aware enough of AI and what that means and what the regulatory challenges are? So these are the things, they're questions, not answers, but hopefully it gives enough for us to have some kind of conversation. Thank you.